They think we are just peasants, but tonight we show them our courage, for our homes, for our freedom.
What if I told you that the most formidable knightly cavalry in Europe was defeated not by a great empire, but by a mob of peasants armed with flails used for threshing grain? The history of warfare knows many examples when technology decided the outcome of a battle, but this case stands apart in the annals of humanity. We are accustomed to thinking that tanks appeared in the 20th century, changing the face of World War I with their tracks and armor. However, the concept of a mobile fortress capable of delivering heavy artillery fire was born 500 years earlier in the heart of Bohemia. It was an era when centuries-old traditions of knighthood were shattered by the iron discipline and engineering genius of a blind old man. Emperors and cardinals viewed this uprising as a rebellion of the common people, but they learned a lesson that forever buried the era of heavy cavalry. Watch the video to the end to find out how a simple cart reinforced with oak planks became the ancestor of modern armored vehicles, and why knights in shining armor fled in panic without even engaging in battle. What if everything you were taught about the submissiveness of medieval man is not true? The history of the Hussite Wars began not on the battlefields, but at the stake in Constance, where the flames consumed the preacher Jan Hus. His death was supposed to put an end to religious disputes, but instead it became a spark that fell into a barrel of powdered popular anger. News of the execution of their beloved preacher reached Prague instantly, turning the grief of the townspeople into a fierce desire for revenge. People took to the streets, tearing down symbols of authority and demanding justice, which they had been denied through peaceful means. The atmosphere in Bohemia grew more heated with each passing day, turning yesterday's peaceful craftsmen into fighters ready for anything. King Wenceslaus tried to calm the situation, but his indecision only added fuel to the fire of the brewing rebellion. The nobility looked on with arrogance, confident that a few exemplary executions would put the rabble back in their place. They did not understand that they were dealing not with an ordinary peasant revolt, but with a movement united by a powerful idea. It was the beginning of the end of the old world, where those in power could dictate their will to the people with impunity. The climax came on the day when an angry crowd approached the new town hall in Prague. The city councillors, locked inside, refused to release the imprisoned supporters of Hus, hoping that the oak doors would hold. However, a stone thrown from a window at the procession was the last straw that broke the rebels' patience. Led by former mercenary Jan Žižka, the crowd stormed the building with the unstoppable force of an avalanche. The judges and the burgomaster were thrown out of the windows directly onto the spears and pikes waiting for them below on the pavement. This event, which went down in history as the first defenestration of Prague, became a point of no return for the entire country. King Wenceslaus, upon learning of what had happened, died of a stroke, leaving the country without a legitimate ruler at the most critical moment. Now his brother, Emperor Sigismund, nicknamed the Red Fox, had to take action against the rebellious Bohemia. He had already gathered a huge army of crusaders from all corners of Europe to crush the uprising with steel. It seemed that the Czechs had no chance of withstanding the armored military machine of the Holy Roman Empire. But the rebels had a trump card that no one took seriously: the one-eyed Jan Žižka. He was not wealthy, had no high titles, and had spent his life in minor skirmishes and mercenary service. But it was this experience that taught him to see war for what it was, without the romanticism of chivalry. Žižka understood that in open terrain, his peasants would be trampled by heavy cavalry in a matter of minutes. He needed to find a way to even the odds, to turn the weakness of his army into its greatest strength. He began to gather around him people who were ready to fight not for money, but for their faith and their right to live. It was not professional soldiers who flocked to his camp, but blacksmiths, plowmen, millers, and their wives. They did not have expensive swords, chainmail, or war horses capable of carrying a rider into battle, but they did have tools that, in skilled hands, could become formidable weapons in close combat. Žižka looked at this motley army and saw in it a potential hidden from the eyes of the haughty aristocrats. Emperor Sigismund declared a crusade, calling on knights from all over Europe to rid Bohemian lands of heretics. Iron clanked along the roads of Germany, Austria, and Hungary, flowing in huge streams toward the borders of Bohemia. The knights rode to war as if to a festival, anticipating easy prey and glory in battles with uncouth peasants. None of them could have imagined that they were riding to their doom and disgrace. They believed in the immutability of the rules of war, which had been established over centuries and seemed eternal. Žižka, however, had no intention of playing by the rules written by his enemies for their own victories. He understood that to defeat the knights, he had to abandon the very idea of knightly combat. He needed total war, where every bush and every hill worked for the defenders. He began to train his men with unprecedented severity and exactingness. It was preparation for a battle that would overturn all notions of medieval military art. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the right of a people to rise up against tyranny, even if the forces are unequal? Write about it in the comments below the video. Your opinion is important to us. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the analysis of the key battles of this war. Guess how long it took to create this? The idea of using carts for defense was not entirely new, but Jan Žižka perfected it, turning it into a system. He understood that in open terrain, infantry would always lose to cavalry due to the difference in weight and speed. Therefore, he decided that his army would carry its walls with it wherever it went. Ordinary peasant carts, which had previously been used to transport hay and manure, became the basis of the new tactic. These carts, or wagons, were heavily modified for military use in field workshops. Thick oak boards were added to one side of the cart, creating a high and sturdy parapet. Special folding shields were suspended under the cart to cover the wheels and the space below from enemy arrows. This turned each cart into a small wooden fortress, capable of withstanding gunfire and spear thrusts. Inside such a cart was a crew of several people, crossbowmen, arquebusiers, and fighters with flails. The main secret of the stability of this design was the system of coupling the wagons together. Each wagon had massive chains and hooks with which it was firmly attached to the neighboring one. Lining up in a circle or square, they formed a continuous wall that could not be pulled apart or overturned by a cavalry charge. Horses, encountering a solid wooden obstacle, stopped, losing the momentum of their momentum. At that moment, the knight turned from a formidable battering ram into a stationary target sitting high in the saddle. Žižka taught his men to assemble this fort, called a Wagenburg, in a matter of minutes at a given signal. On the march, the column of wagons looked vulnerable, but as soon as the enemy appeared, it turned into a protective ring. The horses were unhitched and led inside the perimeter, while the cart shafts blocked the gaps, creating additional barriers. This required coordination comparable to the workings of a clock mechanism on a city tower. Every peasant knew his place and his maneuver, which had been perfected to the point of automatism through constant training. The Wagenburg was not a passive shelter where soldiers simply hid from the enemy in fear. It was an active firing platform, bristling with crossbows and firearms in all directions. The gaps between the carts were used for infantry sorties, which attacked the bogged-down enemy and immediately retreated. Knights accustomed to linear attacks found themselves surrounded on all sides. They circled around the wooden walls, unable to find a vulnerable spot to strike. Particular attention was paid to defending against enemy infantry, who might try to crawl under the carts. This was the purpose of the suspended shields, which were lowered to the ground during battle. In addition, each crew had men with long pikes, ready to pierce anyone who came too close. The Wagenburg was an autonomous combat unit with supplies of food, gunpowder, and arrows. It could hold its ground for days, wearing down the enemy with fruitless attacks. This tactic completely negated the knights' advantage in maneuverability and the striking power of their first attack. Instead of seeking out the enemy, the Hussites forced the enemy to come to them and crash into their walls. This changed the very psychology of battle. The attacker was now at a disadvantage. The knights felt helpless against this wooden snake coiled into a ring. Their code of honor did not know how to fight against carts, and this infuriated them most of all. Žižka also used the terrain to reinforce the impregnability of his mobile fortresses. He tried to place the Wagenburg on top of a hill so that the enemy would have to attack uphill. If there was a pond or swamp nearby, they would always cover one of the flanks, reducing the perimeter of the defense. Nature became part of the fortification, saving the defenders' strength and creating problems for the attackers. The Hussites read the landscape like an open book, choosing ideal positions for their encampments. Europe had never seen anything like it. An army that did not build castles but carried them with them. It was a revolutionary solution to the logistical and tactical problems of the time. Peasants, accustomed to working with carts in peacetime, easily adapted to this new role. The tool of their hard labor became the tool of their liberation and victory. But walls alone do not win battles. They need to be defended. Are you ready to learn how the Hussites used devil's powder to strike terror into the whole of Europe? Want to know a secret that will change the entire military industry forever? At the beginning of the 15th century, firearms in Europe were considered unreliable, expensive, and unchivalrous. Noble warriors despised gunpowder, calling it a devilish invention that kills from afar and without honor. But the Hussites, unburdened by prejudice, saw primitive cannons as the ideal weapon for untrained peasants. They did not need to spend years learning how to shoot a bow. It was enough to learn how to load a pipe with gunpowder. The main individual weapon of the Hussites was the pistola, a short hand cannon on a wooden stock. It was from the Czech word pistola, pipe, that the international word pistol later originated. It was a crude forged iron device that fired stone or lead bullets at short range. The accuracy of such a weapon was extremely low, and hitting a single target was a matter of chance. But when hundreds of pistoli fired simultaneously from the sides of the Wagenburg, a wall of lead was created. In addition to hand weapons, the Hussites actively used light field artillery, the so-called tarazniks and govnisi, from the word hoof crowd. Later, this word was transformed into the familiar howitzer, denoting a weapon for firing at an arc trajectory. These cannons were mounted directly on carts or in the spaces between them on special carriages. They could fire grape shot at advancing infantry or cannonballs at dense rows of cavalry. The mobility of these guns allowed them to quickly transfer their firepower to the threatened area. The main effect of using firearms in those years was not even physical damage, but psychological shock. The roar of gunfire, flashes of flame, and thick clouds of sulfur smoke frightened horses into madness. Knightly horses, accustomed to the clang of swords, shied away from the explosions, throwing off their riders and breaking formation. Smoke covered the battlefield, preventing knights from coordinating their actions and seeing their commander's signals. In this chaos, the disciplined Hussites felt confident, continuing to methodically reload their weapons. For many crusaders, encountering the massive use of gunpowder was akin to encountering magic. They believed that the Hussites had made a deal with the devil since they used hellfire and brimstone. Fear of the unknown weapon undermined morale even before the hand-to-hand combat began. Soldiers were afraid to approach the Wagenburg, which spewed thunder and lightning, preferring to keep a safe distance. This gave the Hussites time to rest and regroup right in the middle of the battle. Žižka developed a special firing tactic combining crossbows and cannons for continuous fire. While the slow arquebuses were being reloaded, the enemy was showered with a hail of crossbow bolts, preventing them from raising their heads. The crossbows were accurate and had a long-range, piercing armor, while the cannons created a dense barrage of fire and a noise effect. This interaction between different types of firearms created an impenetrable zone of death in front of the wagon fort. No one could overcome these last 100 meters without colossal losses. Weapons production was set up directly in the cities controlled by the Hussites with astonishing speed. Bells were melted down for cannons, and saltpeter was extracted from cesspools and cellars. The entire country worked as a single military factory, supplying the front with everything it needed. The simplicity of the design of the arquebuses allowed them to be made in any village smithy. It was the first war in history where firearms became a mass and decisive factor. The Hussites were also the first to use concentrated fire on the commanders of the enemy army. They targeted knights in the richest armor and under the brightest banners. The loss of a commander at the beginning of a battle often led to panic and disorganization of the entire Crusader force. A bullet did not distinguish between a duke and a simple mercenary, making everyone equal in death. This destroyed the social hierarchy of war, rendering nobility a useless defense. The use of firearms by the Hussites forever changed European warfare, beginning the decline of knighthood. The sound of a Czech arquebus shot was the death knell for the age of swords and armor. The world was entering a new era, where chemistry and ballistics determine the outcome of battles. If you enjoyed this analysis of past technologies, please like this video right now. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the rebels' first great victory? In March 1420, a small group of Hussites, numbering only about 400 men, found themselves in a deadly trap. They were pursued by the royal cavalry, numbering more than 2,000 horsemen thirsty for the blood of heretics. There were many women, children, and elderly people among the Hussites, and their weapons left much to be desired. It seemed that they were facing inevitable slaughter in the open field, where there was no chance of escape. Jan Žižka, realizing the criticality of the situation, chose the only possible place for defense: the isthmus between two ponds. One pond had already been drained, and its bottom was sticky, boggy mud. The other pond was full of water, reliably covering the flank of the detachment from being outflanked. This narrowed the front of the attack so much that the numerical superiority of the Royal Knights lost all meaning. Here, on a narrow strip of solid ground, Žižka ordered his first improvised wagon to be built. The knights, seeing a handful of peasants with carts, decided that victory was theirs and neglected reconnaissance. They dismounted as their horses could not pass along the narrow dam and moved into attack in close formation. The Iron Men, known as the Iron Lords, marched confident in the invulnerability of their armor, but they did not take into account that the soft spring soil would turn into a treacherous trap under the weight of their armor. Every step was difficult for them, exhausting their strength even before the first blow of the sword. When the knights approached, they were met with a barrage of fire from crossbows and arquebuses, hitting them point blank. Those who tried to bypass the carts at the bottom of the drained pond instantly sank knee-deep into the deep mud. At that moment, the Hussite women spread their long veils and scarves on the mud. The knights' spurs became entangled in the fabric, and the heavy warriors fell into the mud, unable to get up. They floundered like overturned beetles, becoming easy prey for the light infantry. The Hussites counterattacked, using their mobility and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Lightly armed peasants jumped over the bumps, striking the fallen knights with flails and halberds. The blows shattered helmets and broke bones, despite the high cost of the Milanese armor. The battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse, where the kingdom's elite perished in the mud at the hands of those they considered filth. The pride of knighthood was trampled into the bottom of a Bohemian pond. The fog that descended on the battlefield in the evening completed the rout of the royal forces, sowing panic. The knights could not see where the blows were coming from and retreated in terror, abandoning their wounded comrades. The victory at Soudomierz was a real miracle, which even the Hussites themselves did not believe at first. It showed that the right choice of position and tactics could compensate for a five-fold superiority of the enemy. It was the first wake-up call for the whole of Europe. The old rules of war no longer applied. Žižka emerged from this battle not just as a victor, but as a legend whose name began to be whispered. He proved that his mobile walls worked even in the most unfavorable conditions. The morale of the rebels soared, and now they believed that God was truly on their side. And for the first time, their enemies felt a chilling fear of the army of men with flails. Soudomierz became a baptism of fire for the new military doctrine born in the mind of the old warrior. Here, among the ponds and swamps, the foundations were laid for the future grandiose victories of the Hussite army. But victory in one battle does not mean victory in the war. In the next chapter, you will learn how Žižka turned this success into a system, creating the most disciplined army in Europe. Victories on the battlefield would have been impossible without the iron discipline that reigned in Jan Žižka's army. Unlike feudal armies, where each knight was his own master, the Hussites had strict military regulations. Žižka, realizing that he was dealing with an untrained mass, introduced rules that were punishable by death if broken. This document, known as the Žižka Military Regulations, regulated every aspect of military life. In the Hussite army, looting and pillaging during battle and on the march were strictly forbidden. Anyone who left the ranks for the sake of plunder was subject to immediate execution on the spot without trial. While the Crusaders often lost battles by getting distracted by looting the enemy camp, the Hussites always kept their formation. All captured loot was put into a common barrel and distributed fairly among all the fighters. This eliminated envy and competition within the troops, uniting the people. Special attention was paid to religious life. Prayer was as much a part of service as cleaning weapons. The army began and ended each day with a communal worship service, which maintained high morale and faith in the righteousness of their cause. Priests went into battle alongside the soldiers, carrying a chalice, a symbol of communion under both kinds. This created an atmosphere of a holy army, ready to die for their faith without hesitation. Drunkenness, gambling, and foul language were strictly forbidden in the camp. The organization of the march and the setting up of the camp was perfected by engineers and commanders. Each cart had its own number and its own clearly defined place in the column and in the defense. At the sound of a trumpet, the huge column could fall into battle formation faster than the enemy could unfurl their banners. This required constant training and drills, which were conducted at every spare moment. Žižka turned the peasants into professionals who understood maneuvers at a glance. The army had a clear hierarchy of commanders, appointed not on the basis of nobility, but on merit and experience. Decurions, centurions, and hetmans were personally responsible for their men and the condition of their equipment. The orders of the supreme hetman were not discussed, but carried out unquestioningly and immediately. Such a vertical chain of command was unheard of for medieval militias, which often resembled armed camps. This made it possible to control an army of many thousands as a single living organism. Women also played an important role in the Hussite army, and not only as camp followers. They helped build fortifications, cared for the wounded, and even participated in the defense of wagon forts. Their work in providing for the daily needs of the army allowed the men to focus exclusively on combat tasks. It was a total mobilization of all resources of society for a single purpose. Everyone who could hold a shovel or a crossbow found their place in this machine. The supply system was designed so that the army could operate away from its bases for long periods of time. The Wagenburg carried forges, bakeries, and grain supplies, making the army self-sufficient. Repairs to carts and weapons were carried out directly at rest stops by special craftsmen. This allowed the Hussites to make quick transitions, appearing where they were not expected. Logistics became as much a weapon as cannons. Enemies often underestimated this level of organization, mistaking the Hussites for a disorderly mob of fanatics. But when confronted with them, they encountered a monolithic wall where every cog knew its task. Order trumped class. Discipline trumped individual fencing skills. Jan Žižka created the prototype of a modern regular army 200 years before its official appearance. This charter became the foundation on which the invincibility of the Hussite troops rested for many years. Even after Žižka's death, his principles continued to live on, bringing victory after victory. Discipline turned the anger of the people into a controllable and destructive force. Without this order, any uprising is doomed to failure, no matter how righteous it may be. Are you ready to learn how one hill decided the fate of an entire capital city? In the summer of 1420, Emperor Sigismund laid siege to Prague with a huge army of tens of thousands of crusaders. The city was surrounded, but there was one loophole for supplies, the road passing under Vitkov Hill. If the crusaders had captured this height, Prague would have been completely blockaded, and starvation would have forced it to surrender. Jan Žižka, realizing the strategic importance of this point, personally occupied the hill with a small detachment. At the top of Vitkov, the Hussites hastily erected wooden fortifications, log cabins, palisades, and small moats. The garrison consisted of only a few dozen archers and women ready to fight to the end. On July 14th, thousands of elite German knights, confident of an easy victory, marched against them. The slopes of the hill were steep, but the knights believed that their numbers would sweep away the pitiful handful of defenders. They began their ascent, anticipating a massacre at the top. The battle was fierce and desperate. The knights climbed the walls and the Hussites fought back with everything they had. Crossbow bolts and bullets mowed down the attackers, but there were too many of them, and they continued to climb. When the enemies had almost broken into the fortification, Žižka personally entered the fray, inspiring his people. At a critical moment, according to legend, one of the Hussite women shouted, "A Christian shall not retreat before the Antichrist," and rushed at the enemies. The narrow path on the crest of the hill prevented the knights from deploying their formation and using their numerical advantage. They pushed each other, but the Hussites the rear ranks pressing on the front, creating a crush and chaos. The Hussites took advantage of this, beating them with flails and pushing them down the steep slopes. A fall from such a height for a rider clad in armor meant certain death or serious injury. The hill turned into a meat grinder, where the pride of the empire was crushed by the tenacity of the defenders. In the heat of battle, a detachment of volunteers emerged from the city gates of Prague and struck the Crusaders in the flank. The unexpected attack, accompanied by the ringing of bells and battle hymns, caused panic among the attackers. Fearing encirclement, the knights began a disorderly retreat, crushing their own infantry. The entire slope was littered with bodies and discarded weapons, glistening in the sun. Emperor Sigismund watched in horror as his army was humiliated from the walls of a nearby castle. The victory at Witkov was a turning point in the entire siege of Prague and the First War. It showed that even small forces can stop an armada if they use the terrain wisely. Sigismund, realizing that he could not take the city, soon lifted the siege and retreated. Witkov Hill became a symbol of Czech resilience in Žižka's military genius. This battle demonstrated the importance of tactical initiative and personal courage on the part of the commander. Žižka did not hide behind others. He was where it was most difficult. His example inspired ordinary people to do the impossible and fight to the death. Witkov became the grave of the emperor's hopes for a quick victory over the heretics. After this battle, Žižka's authority became unquestionable, and Prague was saved from destruction. The Crusaders realized that they were not dealing with a rebellion, but with a real war in which they were losing. The defense of Witkov went down in history textbooks as an example of the ideal defense of a key position. The hill held, but what exactly did the simple peasants fight with in close combat when the gunpowder ran out? In the next chapter, you will learn about the most brutal and unusual weapons of the Hussites. The Hussites were not professional warriors, and they did not have the money for expensive swords that required years of training. Therefore, they turned their attention to what they had in their hands every day: agricultural tools. The most terrifying and recognizable symbol of their fury was the battle chain, converted from a tool for threshing grain. An ordinary wooden stick with a movable flail on a leather strap was turned into a devastating weapon. The peasants reinforced the striker with iron spikes and nails and replaced the leather strap with a chain. The result was a weapon with enormous kinetic energy, capable of denting a helmet or breaking a knight's arm with a single blow. The flexible connection allowed them to bypass the enemy's shield. The striker flew over the edge of the shield and struck the enemy on the head or back. Neither chainmail nor plate armor could protect against such a blow. The shock waves simply broke the bones inside. Working with a chain required great physical strength and, more importantly, the ability to work as a team. The Hussites lined up in a row and struck rhythmically, as if threshing grain on a threshing floor. This rhythm created a solid wall of death that was impossible to approach without being struck. A knight who fell under the blows of several chainmen was instantly turned into a cutlet right in his own armor. The sound of chains striking iron became one of the most terrifying sounds for the Crusaders. In addition to flails, various modifications of hooks and grappling hooks were widely used to pull riders from their horses. As soon as a knight was pulled from his saddle to the ground, he became helpless due to the weight of his equipment. On the ground, he was finished off with short knives, hammers, or the same flails. This was not a noble duel, but an effective and cruel job of destroying manpower. The Hussites were not looking for beautiful victories. They needed a dead enemy. Halberds and battle scythes were also popular, allowing the enemy to be kept at a distance and cut down. A reforged scythe, held vertically, could cut a man in half at the waist or sever a horse's head. The simplicity of their manufacture made it possible to arm thousands of people in a matter of days. Any smithy could turn peaceful tools into a deadly arsenal. This weapon reflected the class nature of the war. The tools that fed the peasant now defended him. The symbolism was clear to everyone. They threshed the enemies of the faith just as they threshed wheat. For knights, death by flail was considered shameful, unworthy of a nobleman. But on the battlefield, notions of honor gave way to brute efficiency. The Hussite infantry, armed in this way, was particularly formidable in counterattacks from behind the wagon fort. When the enemy became bogged down in defense, the flailmen broke out and cleared the space in front of the wagons. Their onslaught was so fierce that even elite mercenary infantry could not withstand it. It was a triumph of brute force directed by a skilled hand. The weapons of the common people proved that in war, effectiveness is more important than aesthetics and cost. A cheap chain in the hands of a motivated fanatic was worth more than a Damascus blade in the hands of a mercenary. It was a lesson that the military elite of Europe learned with great bloodshed. The technological gap was bridged by ingenuity and adaptation of familiar things. The skill of wielding this weapon was passed down directly in communities, from father to son. Training with the chain became part of everyday life in Hussite camps. Thus, a new type of infantry was born, one that knew no fear of cavalry. Armed to the teeth, the peasants were dangerous in defense, but Žižka went further. In the next chapter, we will see how he taught his fortresses to move and attack. By the end of 1421, Emperor Sigismund had had enough and brought in a new, even larger army. He trapped Žižka's army near the town of Kutna Hora, famous for its silver mines. The Hussites found themselves completely surrounded, with their backs against the city walls, where the betrayal of the German burghers was brewing. It seemed like the end. Cold, hunger, and the superior forces of the enemy were closing in. Sigismund was already celebrating victory, confident that this time the old fox would not escape. But Žižka made a move that went down in history as the first example of a mechanized column breakthrough. Instead of sitting in defense and waiting for death, he lined up his carts in an offensive column. All the cannons and archers were concentrated at the tip of this column, ready to open fire. It was a battering ram made of wood, iron, and human will, aimed at the weakest point of the enemy's ring. Early in the morning, the Hussites moved forward, firing continuously from all their guns as they advanced. The roar was so loud that, according to chroniclers, it drowned out even their thoughts. The royal troops, not expecting an attack from the doomed, were stunned by the density of the fire. The cannons broke through the ranks of the Hungarian cavalry, and through this breach, the entire Hussite army broke out of the encirclement. Sigismund could not believe his eyes. The prize had slipped away right under his nose. But Žižka did not simply flee, he regrouped and launched a counterattack. He began to maneuver his wagon forts, attacking scattered parts of the imperial army. Now it was the royal troops who found themselves in the role of victims, not knowing where to expect the next blow. The mobile fortresses appeared out of the fog, struck with fire, and then disappeared or took up defensive positions. It was a war of maneuver for which the feudal army was completely unprepared. At the Battle of Nebovity, the Hussites caught up with and defeated a significant part of Sigismund's Hungarian forces. The emperor fled for his life, abandoning his baggage train and treasury. The defeat was complete and humiliating. The huge army was scattered and demoralized. The myth of the invincibility of the Crusaders was finally dispelled in the winter fields near Kutna Hora. This campaign showed that the wagon fort was not only a defensive tool, but also a powerful offensive weapon. Žižka used his wagons like tanks, breaking through the front lines and entering the rear. He dictated the pace of the operation, forcing the enemy to react to his actions. Speed and surprise became the main allies of the Hussites in this winter war. Kutna Hora demonstrated Žižka's genius as a strategist capable of thinking outside the box in critical situations. He saved his army from destruction and turned defeat into triumph. It was a lesson that passivity means death, while boldness is the path to salvation. After this defeat, Europe lost its desire to invade Bohemia for a long time. The Hussites proved that they could defeat the enemy not only from behind walls but also in open battle. The army of heretics became the dominant force in the region, one that everyone had to reckon with. The most striking fact in this whole story is that Jan Žižka won most of his great victories while being completely blind. He lost one eye in his youth and the other during the siege of Rabi Castle in 1421, when a splinter from a tree hit his good eye. For any other commander, this would have meant the end of his career and removal from office. But Žižka continued to command the army, seeing the battlefield through the eyes of his aides. He had a phenomenal memory and spatial imagination, creating a mental map of the terrain in his head. His assistants described the terrain to him, where the stream was, where the hill was, where the forest was, where the wind was blowing from. Based on this information, he positioned his wagon forts and gave orders with the precision of a sighted man. He felt the battlefield, understanding the dynamics of the battle by the sounds. The roar of cannons, the cries of people, the trampling of horses. This ability seemed supernatural to his soldiers, a divine gift. Blindness did not make him weaker. On the contrary, it sharpened his strategic intuition. Without being distracted by the visual chaos of battle, he could focus on the big picture and managing his reserves. Žižka became a living symbol of steadfastness, a blind old man leading his people to the light. His authority was so great that his soldiers were ready to follow him to hell. Even death could not stop his influence on the course of the war. When Žižka died of the plague in 1424, his soldiers, who called themselves orphans, continued his work. Legend has it that he bequeathed that his skin be stripped from his body and stretched over a drum, so that even after death, his voice would strike fear into his enemies and inspire his own. This drum became a sacred relic, its sound heralding the start of an attack. Jan Žižka went down in history as one of the few commanders who never lost a battle. His genius lay not in his knowledge of books, but in his understanding of people and the capabilities of his weapons. He turned the weaknesses of his army into strengths, creating a unique military machine. The blind general saw the future of warfare more clearly than all the sighted monarchs of Europe. His legacy is a tactic that has survived him for centuries. The Wagenburg was used by the Hungarians, Poles, and even Russian troops in their fight against the steppe nomads, Hussite Revolution. The principles of firepower and discipline that he laid down formed the basis of the armies of the modern era. He was an innovator ahead of his time. Žižka proved that strength of spirit and intellect are more important than physical limitations. His figure towers over Czech history as a formidable monument to the will of the people. He was the father of the nation in its bloodiest and most heroic hour. Without him, the Hussite movement would most likely have been suppressed in its infancy. The story of the terrible blind man reminds us that true leadership does not depend on eyesight, but on vision. As is often the case in history, the victors were not destroyed by external enemies, but by internal strife. After Žižka's death, the movement lost the unquestionable authority that had held the disparate groups together. The brilliant campaigns that the Hussites carried out throughout Central Europe earned them a reputation for invincibility. But along with their victories, the ambitions of their leaders and differences in their visions for the future grew. Each clan wanted to assert its own ideas, and compromises became increasingly difficult. The unity of the Hussites began to crack at the seams. After a series of military successes, it became clear that the movement was no longer united. The moderate Hussites sought to preserve what had already been achieved and sought negotiations. The radical Taborites saw the victories as only the beginning of a long struggle to transform society. Their ideals were much broader than simple religious freedom and touched on the social order. The gap between the two camps grew deeper. Internal tensions mounted, like before a storm. The movement split into moderate Chashniks, who wanted to compromise with the king and the church, and radical Taborites, who wanted to continue the war to the end. The Chashniks sought stability and the restoration of order, albeit on new terms. The Taborites, on the other hand, believed that stopping was tantamount to betraying the cause. Their slogans resonated with the poor, who suffered from excessive taxes and oppression. Skirmishes broke out between the two factions. Both sides convinced themselves that they were defending the true doctrine. The gap between them widened until it led to civil war. The moderates accused the radicals of fanaticism, and the radicals accused the moderates of betrayal. Alliances changed like a kaleidoscope, and many former comrades became irreconcilable enemies. The situation became increasingly explosive. The public grew weary of the endless tension, but it was already impossible to avoid a clash. The denouement came in the Battle of Lipany in 1434, where brother fought brother. This battle became a symbol of how revolutions devour their own children. The moderates, having strengthened their forces, decided to deal a decisive blow to the radicals. They understood that a protracted struggle would destroy the Czech lands once and for all. Therefore, they chose a tactic that the Hussites themselves had perfected. It was an irony of history. The moderates, having united with the Catholic troops, used the radicals' own tactics against them. They built a wagon fort and then forced it to feign weakness. The Taborites, confident in their superiority, saw what they thought was a retreating enemy. This aroused their fighting spirit and desire to finish the job with a quick strike, but it was all cleverly planned. The battle turned into a trap. They feigned retreat, luring the Taborites out of their impregnable wagon fort. Confident of victory, the Taborites opened their ranks and rushed forward. Their determination worked against them. They abandoned their fortified position, losing their main defense. At that moment, the outcome of the battle was already decided, but they did not know it. When the orphans opened their wagons and rushed in pursuit, the trap snapped shut. The cavalry of the Allied forces struck from the flanks. The radicals' wagon fort was torn apart, its lines broken. The cavalry broke into the open circle, and the slaughter began. The battle quickly ceased to be a battle and turned into destruction. The fate of the Taborites was decided in a matter of minutes. The defeat at Lipany put an end to radical Hussitism as a military force. The army, feared by monarchies throughout Europe, was destroyed by its former allies. It was a blow of such force that the Taborites were never able to recover. Their political influence also faded before our eyes. The people, shocked by the bloody outcome, realized the consequences. The revolution entered a new phase. Prokop the Great, Žižka's successor, fell in battle. His death killed any hope of restoring the radical wing. The Taborites lost their talented leader and strategic coordination. Middle-ranking leaders died one after another. The army, once renowned for its iron discipline, was now losing the last remnants of order. It was a tragedy. The Taborites' field army was destroyed, and with it their revolutionary plans collapsed. It was a disaster for those who believed in the possibility of profound social change. The death of the best fighters weakened even the religious authority of the movement. The inhabitants of towns and villages understood that the era of radicals was over, but the defeat also marked the beginning of peaceful dialogue. The series of wars was coming to an end. It was a tragedy. The army that all of Europe had been unable to defeat had destroyed itself. Internal conflict proved more destructive than external threats, but this also presented a paradoxical opportunity. The weakened parties were forced to seek compromises. War fatigue began to push people toward peace, and the doors to negotiations began to open. However, defeat paved the way for peace and recognition of some of the Hussites' demands. Europe saw that the Czech Republic was capable of dictating terms. The Catholic Church realized for the first time that its power was not unlimited, and the moderates won a diplomatic victory where the radicals had lost. Religious freedom became a reality. It was partial, but unprecedented. As a result of the Basel Compacts, Emperor Sigismund was recognized as King of Bohemia, but his power was limited by conditions that had previously seemed unthinkable. The Czechs won the right to receive communion under both forms, which was their main symbol. This was the first serious concession by the Catholic Church to the reformers. The possibility of peaceful coexistence emerged. History took a step forward. The Czechs gained a degree of religious autonomy, which set an important precedent. For the first time, a people's army had forced the church to change its rules for the sake of peace. This undermined the idea of papal infallibility. Other nations also began to ask questions. The future of Europe was slowly but surely preparing for the Reformation. Change was already in the air. The Hussite Revolution was the moment when history took a sharp turn. We saw how ordinary people, armed with tools and faith, were able to break the backbone of the best military machine of their time. The wagon forts and artillery of the common people did not just win a few battles, they democratized warfare, making it the business not of a select elite, but of the entire population. Jan Žižka's lessons on discipline, use of terrain, and the power of technology are still relevant today. Knights are a thing of the past, giving way to infantry and cannons, and this transition began right there on the fields of Bohemia. What would you have done if you were an ordinary Prague citizen? Would you have submitted to the authorities or joined the Wagenburg Circle, knowing that the whole world was against you? Write in the comments topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.